Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry I'm not with you today, but I'm traveling, so I did promise you a review, however. So we're still going to go through our book here, and it's not going to be the same review as we normally do. Usually I kind of question you and feel you out and see where you are with your answers. And if I see that there's a lack of clarity there, then we can have a little discussion in class. But I'm not there live, so obviously we're just gonna have to do with the review of some of the concepts and ideas, and maybe I could throw in a page number here and there and lead you into the right direction as far as what to be prepared for. So what we're reviewing today is chapters 10, 11, and 12. And the test is the same, true, false, multiple choice, and you have become accustomed now to this format, so you should know what to expect. So in chapter 10, the author begins the discussion on communicating verbally interculturally. And he says that when we engage in cross-cultural communication, essentially we're entering someone else's house. And because their surroundings is completely not like ours and they don't speak the same language, the words don't really mean what they mean to us sometimes. And so we have to be careful about the meaning of our words. And this entire chapter is, discussing language quite a bit. And this is where the discussion starts right there on pages 178, 179. There is a definition of language that I certainly want you to know. So what is language? What is it made up of? The components. That's right there in your chapter. And we also talked about languages have structure. That's an important feature to remember. There are patterns in languages. There are features. There's grammar in every language. There's no language without grammar, so it's very orderly. And then the topic of arbitrariness came up, and I want you to know what in the world is arbitrariness. If you don't know this right now, you should probably look it up on page 179. But that is something that I need you to know because one of the questions I'm going to ask you will relate to that. And we also talked about how in order to be understood, we have to realize that the words which we say are not really words, they're symbols. And symbols have different meaning to different people. Remember, we played a little exercise where I asked you to close your eyes and imagine things, and everyone saw something else, or you all saw the same things, but in your own way. The details were entirely different. So as we study languages, as we study meaning, as we study this context of communicating interculturally, remember that we're communicating with symbols. That's what we're doing. Words are really not words. Words are symbols. And so we also talked about the rules and what sort of say governs the structure of the sentences. There's a number of items here in the book. The author talks about phonology and morphology and syntax and things like that. And so I want you to know the basic understanding of these things. You don't need to know their definitions. I just need you to know the basic sort of say what it means. So if I ask you a question that has that in it, then if you know what it means, you're not going to get tricked by my question. Let's put it that way. You will know whether what I'm asking you is true or false. And you need to know how these things affect the meaning. You have to understand how the features of grammar can have an effect on meaning, or whether they can or cannot. That is something that you have to obviously distill from your chapter. Let's see. And then there's a discussion on semantics. Remember that we've talked, that's point number 4 on page 180. And when we talked about the different kinds of meanings, the denotative meaning, the connotative meaning, contextual meaning, and figurative meaning. Now, I need you to have a general understanding of what these are. Because if you don't understand what they are, there's going to be a series of questions that I will ask you. And if you don't have a clear understanding of what these meanings are, and how they're different from each other, then it's going to be hard for you to answer my questions. So please make sure that you look this up and that you firm this up in your mind, the difference between those meanings and what do they mean. So let's see. We also talked about um, transmission of one language to another. And we talked about oral transmission and written transmission. And these are two entirely different terms. I remember I told you we use them interchangeably, and we speak, as if one means the other, but really they're two different things. When you write something and you transmit information from one language to another language, there's a special term for that. When you speak and you transmit information from one language to another, there's another term for that that is appropriate. So, and we also speak as we speak, sort of say, and as we communicate. Our communication is so uh, complex. The question that I raised to you in class, and we kind of talked about it and answered it, is whether things really do translate from language to language, whether there is a direct, sort of say, correlation. Is there such thing as a direct correlation from one language to another? Or do things always get lost in translation? We talked about that in class. So hopefully you remember that discussion, and that same discussion occurred in a book. So the author raises the same questions. So if you remember our discussion and you read the book, then you should be able to answer my question on that. The theory of linguistic relativity is another topic that was mentioned in class. Now, I don't really need you to be able to explain it to me or solve it. I don't need you to figure this out for me, but I do want you to know what it is. What is the theory of linguistic relativity? If you explain it to me in your own way, then you really understand what it is. So as we moved on in that class, we also I pointed out the chart on page 187. That was quite important. And so, when something is important, I'm going to come back to that chart later on. And so this is the low context, high context chart. Now, I need you to have an understanding what is a low context culture and what is a high context culture. How are they different? How do they rely on communication? What types of communication do they exhibit? What do they expect? And so, obviously, there's a big difference between low context and high context culture, and the parts of the world where people live do directly affect which part of which culture will they be. Is it going to be a low context or high context? So um, I need you to be clear on that. So that chart is on page 187. If you remember our discussion, I wish I could help you as far as like to see if, whether you have grasped this concept entirely or not. But I'm not there to verify that. So this is the best that I can do, is to point you to a right page in a book, and hopefully you remember what we've talked about, and that's the concept that has been, set firm in your mind. So as you look through different people groups, as you look through different nationalities, you should be able to place them on the chart. You should be able to say, well, so and so, probably fit into the high context group. So and so are in low context group. And really, we're talking in relation to each other more than anything, rather than properly sort of say fitting somebody in. So as long as you understand the chart, I think you'll be able to answer my question. But these people groups are quite important for you to be able to place them in some relation to each other on this scale. So we also talked about in this book how the person's religious thinking, person's philosophy, person's way of life can affect the way they communicate and the way they speak. And we talked about different codes of communication. Uh, and uh, and is it important in a culture to speak, or is it important in a culture not to speak? And so remember that discussion between East and the West, how much people communicate, how much they choose not to communicate, and why. That's something obviously that I will expect for you to know, and there'll be a couple of questions associated with that topic. So if you remember that discussion, it will help you. If not, on page 188 is where I would like you to review a few of your notes if you made notes on that page. Let's see. Status consciousness is another topic that we talked about, and I need you to understand the difference between Western and Asian societies and their understanding of status and group consciousness. And so, how does that affect their communication? What does it do? Essentially, does it affect their communication, and in which way? That's on page 189. And of course, I need you to have a general understanding of East and West, and we always talk about East and West all the time. So how do people communicate from East to West? Let's see. That's really the main questions that I wanted to ask you out of that chapter. And then the chapter 11 is on verbal diversity among Americans, and we talked about how people within the same culture, within the same group, communicate. And especially if you remember our discussion in class, we brought up Professor Deborah Tennant and her research and how she looked at communication between men and women. And the question is, how different it is. And so she compared the communication between men and women to an intercultural discourse, saying that that's how different it is, as if men are belonging to one culture and women belonging to a different culture. That's how different we communicate. So there's a number of observations that she made as far as the style of communication between men and women. Who uses more adjectives? Who uses more expletives? Who communicates in this fashion as far as to reinforce intimacy, and who communicates to negotiate their status. Remember these kinds of comments that Professor Tennant was explaining to us. And so what are the purposes for men communicating? What are the purposes for women communicating? That I need you to know that. It's all right there on page 199 in our chapter. So if you're looking at that right now, would be the perfect opportunity to look over a few notes on that page if you made them. And so, what are the purposes of men and women speaking? There are different purposes. So basically, the features of female speech and male speech and the purposes of that speech, I want you to know. So as we talked about different speaking styles, we talked about Black English on page 200. The author speaks about this phenomenon, and so he makes a few comments about it, saying that it has a unique syntax and unique vocabulary. And so remember, I asked you a question in class. What do you think? Is it a proper language or is it not? Is this, and we kind of talked back and forth a little bit, but I do value your opinion and what you think, but what I need you to know is what the author says in the textbook, and that's right there in chapter 11 on page 200. So if you just refer to your textbooks, that's really where the answers lie. So what you are getting quizzed on is not necessarily our conversation so much. And I value your opinions very much, but it is the text of the book that's really important when it comes to quizzes. So in Black English, we talked about humor, we talked about joking, and the humorous routines, such as bravado and talking trash, and we really didn't go into that so much because we were kind of running behind, and I didn't have a lot of time to get into it. But the use of emphatic language and humor, and that's all really a part of a very cultural speech. And so sometimes people exaggerate, sometimes people use kind of strange humor, and to an outsider, it certainly appears completely strange. You would not expect foreigners to actually understand that feature of a very colloquial language. When someone speaks Black English just because, they're Black, somebody comes from Africa, they hear that and they have no idea what that means. So remember, we talked about some of our African students. I asked you questions, and you shared a couple of instances where you just could not understand people at all, even though people look the same way. They speak an entirely different language, or the words that they mean have a unique context, and they will not be understood. So it's not really about culture or race or anything like that. It is about being in the know when someone is speaking. So let's see, humor, emphatic routines. We talked about that. And we did mention that religious beliefs also influence the way that people speak. And particularly, we talk about Asians, how Asians are very much influenced by their religious beliefs and how they speak. And so that's, important to keep in mind. Remember that their speaking style is basically not to say much. And of course, that is the whole idea of meditation in Buddhism, and kind of sitting, being quiet, and meditating, becoming one with the universe. So, that's the idea. And we talked about Asian communication specifically, and we highlighted what is important for Asians and when they're communicating. What is the sort of say their feature? What do they seek in communication? And that has to do a lot with their religious beliefs too, by the way. So the way they speak is reflecting on their religious beliefs. Then we also highlighted Mexican culture, and we talked about how Mexicans communicate very differently from Americans, and certainly very differently from Asians or others. They have their own unique communication style. They are, fill it with grandeur and verbal play and exaggerations, and sometimes we mentioned that when Mexicans speak, people can have an impression that they're not being entirely honest, that they're exaggerating things, that they're just pushing a little bit too far, and now it's outside of the realm of truth. So, and that is explained. The author explained that to us in the book with two concepts of reality, two kinds of realities, and you need to know about that. That's let's see. I guess Mexican speaking style begins on page 206, and that's where I need you to kind of look over that. Um, so in your textbook on page 206 is where the two different realities are mentioned. And then the other part of this chapter also brought up the idea of slang and cant and jargon, and we talked about that in class. What is the difference between those terms? I do want you to know what they are. I need you to be able to understand. I mean, if you can give me your own definition of what is a slang and what is cant and what is jargon and how they're different, that's how I know that you will understand it. So I'm sorry I can't test you to that right now in class, but if you can test yourself by saying, do I know what slang is? Can I define it to myself? Can I differentiate that from jargon? Can I differentiate that from cant? And if you cannot do that, then maybe you should look things up on page 208 and 209, where that discussion is being carried out. So I simply need you to understand these concepts and these ideas. Let's see. Um, that's where we are. And I think that was the last thing we talked about in this chapter. And that means that now I'm getting into chapter 12. And so chapter 12 in our textbooks is on communicating non-verbally interculturally. And I'm sorry, we don't get a chance to go over this in class, but I'll have to do some highlights just now over the YouTube for you. So nonverbal communication, verbal and nonverbal communication on page 216 is an important section for you to know. And it's a bit of a tricky section, so let me see if I can explain it to you in a simple way. Um, the author says that nonverbal communication refers to communicative behaviors and events that do not involve spoken or written language. So what is nonverbal communication then? Well, gestures, little nods or winks or sighs or anything of that matter. Any kind of waving your hands in a certain way or something like that. It's all nonverbal communication. Um, so that's we actually communicate non-verbally just as much as we do verbally, if not more. And sometimes you don't have to say anything. You just have to see the people's faces, and you know what they're trying to say without even opening their mouth. So it's quite powerful tool. So the way eye movements and gestures and posture, all of that can be judged. But the point that the author makes is they're not the same from culture to culture. One gesture can have multiple meanings. In one culture it means one thing, in another culture it means another thing. So these are entirely different concepts. You may be banking on the idea that you understand someone's nonverbal communication, where in reality you don't, because what means one gesture that can mean, okay in one language can mean something entirely different in another language. So gestures are not a safe way to communicate interculturally because the meanings are so diverse. Hand gestures in particular. Let's see, what else do I need to mention in this chapter about communication? Let's see. Nonverbal communication supports the verbal. That is something that the author tells us, that basically nonverbal communication communicates emotions, it communicates immediacy, it communicates urgency. When we speak and we're emotional about something, we start waving our hands or start expressing ourselves in a very colorful way. And so that lets a person know that we're passionate about something. So we're saying something that's really important. And so usually nonverbal communication ends up supporting the verbal. So whatever we're saying and then what we're communicating without the use of our speech or writing goes along with that. So as I said, each culture has its own unique body language and their own gestures that's unique. Um, we talked about different people, like Japanese, for example. They don't hold hands in public. They don't uh, they don't hug. They don't embrace in public. On page 219, the author tells us that they find social kissing embarrassing. So you won't see Japanese couples smooching in the park on the bench. That's not going to happen. In their culture, that is just simply not acceptable. You don't have these public displays of affection in Japanese society. Maybe if they travel to America, they will feel free to do that, but in their own country, in their own culture, they would not be able to do that. So just even a couple that is married or engaged, walking down the street holding hands, even that would be, a bit too much for them. Why? Because they're not into public displays of affection in their culture. That is something that they do not do. So that's how uncomfortable, sort of say, their culture finds that. And let's see, what else? Nonverbal behavior here that I need to highlight. I'm just trying to go through the most important things. I mentioned that. I mentioned this. Body movement. Yes, body movement is very important. There's a really good example on page 221 there, right there at the top. Let's see. Well, the main thing that I want you to know is that, for example, the author mentions on page 222 that sometimes, this is a good illustration of how our gestures can be entirely different. In Bulgaria, when you nod up and down like this, okay, that means no. But when you go from side to side, that means yes. So it's exactly the opposite of our culture. So how in the world would you do that? The only way you would know is when somebody tells you. So you observe the culture and you see how people communicate, and that's how you learn. So you come to Bulgaria and you start saying yes, and people don't understand you because in their country that's a no. So sometimes it just um, you know we simply have a expectation thinking that everybody else communicates like we do, but they don't. So there's a couple other examples that the author mentions in this chapter that I'm just going to highlight for you, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because those are the main things that I want you to know. The chapter is kind of long. Uh, the author mentions that punctuality for Japanese. He talks about how that's very important for them, and so it, and it's important for everyone. You know, it doesn't really matter. You remember, there's different status or say value in Japanese culture. It's a very hierarchical culture, recognizes people of different status, and that's how they relate to each other, not necessarily in a linear way, but a complementary way. And so in Japanese culture, punctuality, for example, is very important. So how would you think, people who are of a different status would be perceived being punctual, not punctual? Would you be able to get away with not being punctual if you're the boss? Let's put it that way. Or is that just as disrespectful as an employee being not punctual? So and that's the case. The case is that it's a social norm that is basically enforced across the borders. You know, it doesn't really matter who you are, whether you're a boss or an employee. You know, you both can be late. So in other cultures, the boss is never late; he's always on time. But not in Japanese culture. And then another example is, for example, among the Africans, many African cultures, many African countries, looking someone in the face, eye to eye contact when you're speaking is considered disrespectful, especially if you're speaking to someone who is an elder. So you never look elder in the eyes. Instead, what you do is you look down, and that's how you speak to an elder. You don't look up, and you do not look them straight in the eyes, because that's a challenge, that's disrespect, that's boldness. So you look down when you speak to an elder, and that's very normal. And not just in Africa, in other countries as well. There's a number of cultures that have that same belief. So now imagine somebody coming over to this country, and a kid from Africa comes and goes to an American high school, and the teacher talks to him, and he doesn't look the teacher in the eyes. Why? Because that is his way of showing respect. Well, then all of a sudden the teacher starts getting upset and says, look at me, look at me, look at my eyes. I'm talking to you." And the kid just won't look up. Why? Because in his culture, that is the way you show respect to an adult. That is the way you show respect to an elder, and he just can't help it. He can't help it. He has to abide by his own cultural norms. It will take him a long time to retrain himself and relearn a new way of doing things. So anyway, these are the kinds of things that I want you to know, basically, from this chapter, from chapter 12. I think I've highlighted the most important things I want you to know, and I'm not going to quiz you on the rest of it. It's a long chapter. So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, that was pretty much your review. Hopefully, you had a chance to catch up a little bit. I mentioned a few page numbers. You should have been able to make some notes. So please take a couple of minutes, look this over, and then there's a quiz waiting for you. So hopefully you will do well. I know that if you have studied, you will do well. So I don't have any doubt in you. I have faith in you. And so please take your quizzes and then turn them in, and I'll get them week I come back, and I'll start grading them. So thank you very much, and I hope you do well in this test.